Some nations are born from conquest, others from innovation. But the Zulu kingdom, its story is drenched in blood. Before the name Zulu meant empire, before it stood for defiance against the might of Great Britain, it was just the name of a tiny, insignificant clan. We're talking about a group of maybe 1,500 to 2,000 people, occupying a small patch of land by the White Umfolozi River. They were nobodies, overshadowed by powerful confederacies like the Mthethwa and the Ndwandwe, and they seemed destined to be forgotten. But history isn't always written by the powerful. Sometimes it's violently rewritten by a single person with an unbreakable will. This is the story of how one man, an outcast born from a forbidden union, would turn his own rejection into fuel to forge a nation in a fire of unimaginable violence. It's the story of a military genius who reinvented warfare, a political architect who built an empire from scratch, and a tyrant whose brutality became the stuff of legend. This is the account of how ambition, rage, and a thirst for absolute power created a people and unleashed a storm that would reshape a continent forever. This is the blood-soaked birth of the Zulu kingdom. The world Shaka was born into, around 1787, was a complex web of rival chiefdoms. The Nguni-speaking peoples of Southeastern Africa lived in a delicate and often violent balance. Society revolved around clans and kinship, with patriarchal households as the basic, self-sufficient units of their world. Power belonged to chiefs, who led in war and judged in peace. But these weren't sprawling empires. They were loose confederations, held together by shaky alliances, tribute, and the personal charisma of a paramount chief. Before the Zulu rose, the big players were the Mtetwa, led by a visionary chief named Dingiswayo, and the Ndwandwe, led by the formidable Zwide. The Zulu themselves? They were just a small tributary clan in the Mtetwa Confederacy, known for little more than their tobacco. Warfare, while common, was often a ritualized affair. It was more like a contest of champions, with small forces clashing, armed with long, light-throwing spears called assegai. Battles were about showing off, stealing cattle or settling fights over grazing land. They weren't typically wars of total destruction. That idea, total war, hadn't really taken root yet. But the seeds of change were in the ground. Populations were growing, fertile land was getting scarce, and a long drought was creating fierce competition for what was left. Trade with the Portuguese at Delagoa Bay was also introducing new ideas about wealth and power. It was a world on the brink of a violent transformation. And into this powder keg, a catalyst was born. His name was Shaka. Shaka's story doesn't start with glory, it starts with shame. He was the son of kaSenzangakhona, the chief of the tiny Zulu clan, and a woman named Nandi, a princess of the neighboring Lanjeni clan. Their union was forbidden. Custom dictated their clans were too closely related for marriage, making their child illegitimate. When Nandi's pregnancy became obvious, kaSenzangakhona and the Zulu elders just laughed it off. They claimed her swollen belly wasn't a child, but a common intestinal parasite, an Shaka. So in a stunning act of defiance when her son was born, Nandi named him just that, Shaka. His name was an insult, a permanent reminder of his rejection. kaSenzangakhona did eventually marry Nandi, making her his third wife, but the stigma never went away. Their relationship was a mess, and life in the Zulu royal court was a nightmare of humiliation for both mother and son. Nandi was a strong-willed woman, and that didn't go over well with the king. Eventually, it all became too much. When Shaka was about 6 years old, he and his mother were exiled, kicked out of his father's home. They tried to find refuge with Nandi's people, the Langeni, but got no welcome there either. They were outcasts. Shaka's boyhood was fatherless, filled with torment and neglect. He was mercilessly bullied by other boys for his illegitimate status. But this constant harassment didn't break him. It forged him. The bitterness of exile, the rage at his tormentors, and his mother's fierce, protective love built in him a terrifying resolve and a burning ambition. He would spend his life getting even with everyone who had ever wronged him and his mother. Around 1802, a terrible famine drove Nandi and her son from the Langeni lands. Adrift and desperate, they finally found shelter with the Ndwandwe people, a part of the powerful Mthethwa paramountcy, ruled by the chief Dingiswayo. It was here, among the Mtetwa, that the outcast boy would finally start his journey to becoming a warrior. Life among the Mtetwa gave Shaka something he'd never had before: a chance. When he came of age, around 23, Shaka was drafted into the Mtetwa army under Dingiswayo. And here, in the disciplined ranks of a real fighting force, Shaka's natural talents exploded. He was tall, powerful, and had a raw courage and authority that made him stand out. For 6 years, he served as a warrior, and his brilliance was impossible to miss. Dingiswayo wasn't a typical chief. He was a modernizer, a man who wanted to build a larger state through both conquest and diplomacy. He had already started reforming his army, organizing warriors into age-grade regiments called Ibuto that fostered loyalty to him over their individual clans. He saw something in Shaka, not just a brutal fighter, but a sharp, strategic mind. Shaka quickly became a favorite of the paramount chief, but Shaka wasn't satisfied with being a good soldier. He was a revolutionary. He looked at traditional Nguni warfare and thought it was all wrong. The throwing spear, the assegai, was a weapon of indecision. You threw it from a distance, and half the time it missed or got stuck in a shield. Fights were ritual, not decisive. Shaka imagined a new way of fighting: brutal, close-quarters combat. His first innovation was simple but radical. He threw away his sandals. He argued they were clumsy and slowed a warrior down. Barefoot, he was faster, more agile, and had a better grip. This allowed him to close the distance on an enemy in a flash. Next, he changed his weapons. He developed a larger, heavier shield, not just for defense, but as a weapon. He taught himself to hook his opponent's shield with its left edge, exposing their body for a killing blow. And then came his masterstroke. He redesigned the spear. He got rid of the long, flimsy throwing spear and created a new weapon: a short, heavy-shafted stabbing spear with a long, broad blade. It was called the ikalwa, named for the sucking sound it made when pulled from a human body. You didn't throw this weapon. You used it to kill, up close and personal. Dingiswayo, blown away by this ferocious and innovative warrior, promoted him again and again. Shaka became one of his most trusted commanders, earning the name Nodumelezi, the one who, when seated, causes the earth to rumble. Dingiswayo became his mentor, supporting his radical ideas. Under Dingiswayo's guidance, Shaka wasn't just learning how to fight. He was learning how to lead, how to organize, and how to build power. The outcast had found a patron. The warrior was becoming a king in waiting. In 1816, news came that kaSenzangakhona, chief of the Zulu and the father who had cast Shaka out, was dead. For anyone else, it might have been distant news. For Shaka, it was the moment he had been waiting for his entire life. His ambition, sharpened by years of exile and war, now had one target: the throne that should have been his. He wasn't the legitimate heir, not by a long shot, but he had something better than a legitimate claim. He had the backing of Dingiswayo. The Mthethwa chief saw a chance to install a loyal and brutally effective leader over the Zulu clan. He released Shaka from his service and gave him a military escort to enforce his claim. Shaka's return wasn't a negotiation, it was a hostile takeover. He arrived to rule a Zulu clan that was still tiny, but from day one, he ruled with an iron fist. He faced down his half-brothers, who had a better claim to the throne, and eliminated them without a second thought. Any opposition, no matter how small, was met with immediate death. There was no room for debate in Shaka's new order. There was only his will. He immediately started putting his military and social reforms into practice. He took the largely ceremonial Zulu fighting force and turned it into a ruthlessly efficient army. He conscripted young men into his new Amabuto regiments, shattering old clan loyalties and forcing them to pledge allegiance to him and him alone. This wasn't just a military change, it was a social one, rebuilding society around the army and putting all power in his hands. Then, just 2 years into his reign, in 1818, everything changed. His mentor, Dingiswayo, was captured and executed by his great rival, Zwide of the Ndwandwe. The Mtetwa Confederacy, held together by Dingiswayo's leadership, immediately fell apart. The army scattered, leaving a massive power vacuum. For Shaka, this was both a crisis and the opportunity of a lifetime. With his mentor gone, he was now his own master. He quickly rallied the defeated Mtetwa forces, who were now leaderless and desperate. He absorbed them into his own growing army. In a few swift moves, Shaka, the chief of the once-forgotten Zulu, became the heir to Dingiswayo's military might. His old enemy, Zwide, was now his main rival. The stage was set for a war that would decide the fate of the entire region. Shaka was no longer just the chief of the Zulu. He was the master of a terrifying military machine, and he was ready to use it. With the Mtetwa forces under his control, Shaka now had the army he needed to turn his revolutionary ideas into terrifying practice. What he created was arguably the most effective fighting force in southern Africa at the time, an engine of conquest that would carve a path of destruction across the continent. His reforms changed the very meaning of war in the region, turning it from a ritual into a method of annihilation. The heart of his system was the Ibuto, the age-based regiments he perfected. Young men were taken from their homes and families, their old clan identities stripped away, and organized into regiments based on age. They lived in royal barracks, under Shaka's direct command. Their loyalty wasn't to their family or village chief. It was to their regiment, and above all, to Shaka. He had created a standing, professional army. Discipline was absolute and merciless. Shaka drilled his troops constantly, forcing them on barefoot marches of over 50 miles a day to harden them. Any sign of weakness was punished with death. In battle, retreat or failure meant execution. This forged an army that was fearless, cohesive, and fanatically loyal. Then there were the weapons. The throwing spear was gone. Every warrior now carried the short, stabbing Iklewa. The shield was bigger, acting as a wall of cowhide that could absorb a volley of enemy spears as the Zulu impi charged forward. It was also used offensively to hook an opponent's shield aside, creating an opening for the Iklewa to do its brutal work. But Shaka's real genius was in his tactics. He created a battlefield maneuver so devastating it became his signature. the Buffalo Horns Formation, or Impondo Zenkomo. The army was split into 4 parts. The chest, Isifuba, made of the most experienced warriors, would hit the enemy head-on, pinning them in place. While the chest held the enemy in a bloody stalemate, the horns, Izimpondo, made up of the youngest and fastest warriors, would race out to the sides, encircling the enemy and cutting off all escape. Once the enemy was pinned by the chest and trapped by the horns, the real slaughter would begin. Attacked from all sides, the enemy army would be systematically destroyed. And behind it all sat the 4th group, the Loins, Umuva, a reserve of veteran warriors. They would sit with their backs to the fight, staying fresh and calm. If the enemy threatened to break through, or if a part of the Zulu line weakened, the Loins would be sent in to plug the gap or deliver the final crushing blow. This combination of discipline, weaponry, and tactics was unstoppable. The first major test came against Zwide and the Ndwandwe. At the Battle of Gockley Hill in 1818, Shaka's smaller but better organized force used the terrain to beat back Zwide's army. 2 years later, the final showdown came at the Battle of the Mthethwa River. There, the buffalo horns worked to perfection. Zwide's army was surrounded and utterly crushed. Shaka was now the undisputed master of the land. His military revolution was complete. The defeat of Zwide didn't bring peace. It triggered a period of unprecedented chaos and violence known as the Mfecane, or Mfecane, a word that means the crushing or the scattering. While modern historians know its causes were complex, involving drought and pressure from European colonists, there's no doubt that Shaka's rise and the explosive growth of his kingdom were a primary engine of the chaos. The defeated clans didn't just disappear. They became desperate refugees swarming across the land. Groups like the Hlubi and Ndwandwe fled west, destroying anyone in their path. One of Shaka's own brilliant commanders, Mzilikazi, eventually broke away and led his Ndebele people on a devastating migration north, carving out a new empire of his own. It was a domino effect of carnage. Fleeing groups attacked their neighbors to survive, who in turn attacked their neighbors. It was a chain reaction of war and displacement that spread across thousands of square miles from the 1810s to the 1840s. Entire societies were wiped out, their people either killed or forcibly absorbed into new, larger groups. Famine and chaos followed. The old way of life was torn to shreds, and at the center of this storm was Shaka. His conquests were systematic and brutal. Clans that resisted were annihilated. Their warriors were killed. Their women and children were absorbed into the Zulu nation, and their cattle were seized. Those who submitted were enrolled in his regiments and became tools of his will, sent to conquer the next tribe in line. How many people died during the Mfecane? Traditional accounts have suggested staggering figures, as high as 1 to 2 million people. Most modern historians believe those numbers are exaggerated, though the true death toll is unknown and was undoubtedly immense. What is certain is that the devastation was on a scale that's hard to comprehend. It depopulated huge areas of land, leaving them eerily empty, a fact that European settlers would later use to justify their own expansion. This was the blood-soaked birth of the Zulu kingdom in its starkest form. The nation was forged not just by unifying clans, but by violently destroying countless others. By 1827, at the height of his power, Shaka's kingdom was the largest in southern African history. From a clan of a few thousand, he now ruled a domain estimated by some to hold as many as 250,000 people, with an army of up to 50,000 warriors. But this empire was built on a mountain of skulls. As Shaka's power grew, so did his tyranny. The same ruthlessness that made him a brilliant conqueror was now turned on his own people. His reign became one of paranoia and purges. He never took a legal wife or officially fathered an heir he would acknowledge, fearing any son would one day plot against him. While some oral traditions whisper of children who were never recognized, if any of his hundreds of concubines became pregnant, she, and often her entire family, was executed. Loyalty was rewarded, but the slightest hint of dissent was met with a gruesome death. Warriors were clubbed to death for not showing enough courage. Enemies and subjects who displeased him were impaled on stakes or thrown into a kraal with starving hyenas. The cruelty that had been forged in his bullied childhood was now unleashed by an absolute despot. The most infamous moment of his reign came in 1827, after the death of his mother, Nandi. The woman who had protected him, who he had made Queen Mother, was gone. Shaka's grief was monstrous, and he forced the entire kingdom into a hysterical, state-enforced mourning. He decreed that for a year, no crops could be planted. No milk, the staple of the Zulu diet, could be used. Any woman found pregnant during this time was to be executed along with her husband. And in a wave of mass paranoia, he ordered the execution of anyone who wasn't grieving hard enough. Traditional accounts claim that as many as 7,000 people were killed in this madness. While some historians question the literal accuracy of these numbers, the story itself shows just how far Shaka's tyranny could go. This was the last straw. He sent his exhausted army out on another grueling campaign, pushing them past their limits. His paranoia and cruelty were now threatening the very kingdom he had built. His closest followers began to fear for their own lives. The end came on September 22nd, 1828. With the main army away, Shaka's two half-brothers, Ndwandwe and Mfecane, conspired with a disgruntled servant. They found Shaka at his royal kraal and stabbed him to death. The architect of the Zulu Empire, the military genius, the tyrant king, was struck down not by a foreign army, but by his own family. Shaka's story is a brutal, complex, and absolutely fascinating chapter in world history. If you want to explore more epic tales of empires forged in fire, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. So what's your take? Was Shaka a nation-building hero, a bloodthirsty tyrant, or something else entirely? Let us know in the comments below. Shaka's reign lasted only 12 years, but in that short time, he completely changed the course of Southern African history. He took a marginal clan and turned it into the most powerful indigenous empire in the region, a centralized, militarized state that would outlive him by half a century. His legacy is, to put it mildly, contentious. He's remembered as a military genius, a symbol of African strength, and a source of immense cultural pride. Yet he is also remembered as a despot whose conquests unleashed the Mfecane, a wave of death and destruction that destabilized a continent. His rule was built on fear, and his power was maintained through unimaginable cruelty. Shaka's life is a testament to how one person's will can bend the arc of history. He was a creator and a destroyer, a unifier and an annihilator. His story, written in blood, is a stark reminder of the violent process through which nations are so often born.